Hey, welcome to another Bible study here at Influence Church. We are in the book of Genesis and we've covered a lot of great topics thus far. So if you missed any of those previous studies, what you can do is you can go to our YouTube channel, click under the videos tab, and you can rewatch any of our Bible studies as well as our sermons. As a matter of fact, if you have not done it as yet, click that subscribe button, click that share button. We're about to get into our study for today, and we're going to be doing things different today. Usually we would study a topic, but today we're going to be studying a person. We're actually going to be studying the life of a very popular Bible character, the one that is known as the father of the nation of Israel, the one that is known as a man of great faith. And we're going to be studying today the life of Abraham. That's right, we're going to be studying the life of Abraham. We're going through Genesis chapter 12 through chapter 25, right? All this encompasses the life of Abraham. So you want to get a notepad and something to write with so that you can take as many notes as possible. A lot of information is going to be coming your way, fair warning. So be ready to grasp it as quickly as possible. If you have to replay certain parts of the study afterwards, no problem. You can do that to be able to get all the information in that we're going to be covering today. I promise you something. You're going to discover some things about Abraham that you never knew before. As a matter of fact, the last topic on the life of Abraham that we're going to cover today, just before his death, you're going to see that Abraham did something before he died that you never knew and you would have never expected. For me, I've grown up in Christian community. I've heard the story of Abraham, the life of Abraham so many times, but I actually never knew this piece of information about Abraham. So you definitely want to stay to the end to get that information. So let's get into our study for today. And like I said, we're doing Genesis chapter 12 through 25. So we're going to start off with the background of Abraham. And Abraham was born in Ur, the land of the Chaldeans. And he lived in Haran because his father and his entire family moved from the land of Ur, and they moved to Haran because they were heading to Canaan, which was eventually become the promised land, but they end up settling in Haran and they never went to Canaan. By occupation, Abraham was a livestock owner. He had many animals that he reared. His relatives, he had two brothers, Nahor and Haran, right? And Haran, not to be mistaken with the location that they were living in, called Haran as well. His father's name was Terah. His wife's name was Sarah, and he had a nephew named Lot. His sons, their names were Ishmael and Isaac, right? So this is just a background. Then as we move into Genesis chapter 12, we see the call of God over Abraham's life. And it says in Genesis chapter 12 that God said to Abraham, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, and go to the land which I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great. And you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And this was the call of God over Abraham's life. And we know that this call is actually not just prophetic, but it has been fulfilled, because through the lineage of Abraham, we have Jesus being born. And through Jesus, all the families of the world are blessed through that relationship with Jesus Christ being our Savior, our Redeemer, our soon coming King. So this was the call, right? And this call occurred when Abraham was 75 years old, and he left Haran to follow this call of God to go to this land that God would show him, which would become Canaan. Now, Abraham took Lot, the son of Haran. Now, Abraham is believed to be the oldest brother, because when you read Genesis chapter 11, it lists that Terah was his father, and then it lists the three sons. Abraham's name is listed first. Then we have his brother, who is called Noah, and then we have Haran. So based on that list in order, I would say Abraham is the oldest, then we have Noah, then Haran is the youngest. Now Haran died. He passed away, and I believe Abraham, being the oldest brother, would have taken care of son, which was Lot, which is the son of Haran, as his own son. He would have adopted him as his own and cared for him as his own. So when Abraham left his family to leave Haran to go to Canaan, the land that God would show him, he took Lot with him, because Lot was very much his son, not just his nephew. Right? He also took Sarah, his wife, or Sarai at this point in time she's called, and he took all their possessions, and he also took all their people, as in all those that served in his house, all those that were part of his workers, that were part of rearing the livestock that he had. So he took all of them with him. This was the call. Now, in Genesis chapter 12, right after we see the call of Abraham, we also see something that happens, which is the lie of Abraham. Abraham lies, right? So he moves to Canaan, and in Canaan, he's there, and there's a famine that occurs over the land. And when this famine occurs, he goes to Egypt. Now, in Egypt, he decides that my wife Sarah, Sarai, she's very beautiful. And he's convinced in his heart that if the Pharaoh and the Egyptians know that Sarai is his wife, that they will kill him to take Sarai as their own wife. So instead, what he does is he tells the Pharaoh that Sarai is actually his sister. He lies. And what occurs is that by lying to the Pharaoh, the Lord actually sends a plague upon Pharaoh and his house, because Pharaoh did take Sarai and was about to make her his wife. He didn't do it as yet, he was about to. And because of that, God sent a plague over the land of Egypt and over Pharaoh. And Pharaoh had to send Abraham and Sarai out. He realized that Abraham was lying. Abraham and Sarai had to leave the land of Egypt, and then they returned to Canaan once more. What we see very interesting happening now in chapter 14 of Genesis is we see an aspect to Abraham that we very rarely hear about. And this was him being a warrior, him actually leading a military group or leading a group of soldiers into battle as the head of that army, right? This is very interesting, because what happens is that Lot is caught in a battle, right? Lot, he moves to Sodom, and in that space where he's in Sodom, there's a battle in the valley of Sodom. And there are 4 kings that go up against 5 kings, the kings of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah. They are part of the 5 kings, and they lose the battle. And Sodom and Gomorrah is captured by these 4 kings. Now, when it's captured by these 4 kings, obviously Lot and his family and all Lot's possessions is captured as well by these 4 kings that take over the land of Sodom and Gomorrah. Word gets back to Abraham, and Abraham decides that he is going to fight this battle. Now imagine, right? This battle was just fought between 4 kings, 4 mighty kings and their armies, and 5 kings, right? The 4 kings won, which means that these 4 kings and their armies were stronger than these 5 kings. Abraham, who is the owner of livestock, he now is deciding that I am going to go into battle to get back my nephew. Remember, Lot was like a son to him. He would do anything for Lot. Get back my nephew, take back not just my nephew, but his wife and his possessions and everything that was taken away from him. I'm going to get all of that back. I'm going to war. And the Bible tells us that Abraham armed 318 of his trained servants. So he had servants that was trained in combat and battle. And he took these servants, he divided them into forces by night, and he went and attacked these 4 kings, and he took back all that was captured by these kings. He brought back all the goods, and he brought back Lot and all Lot's goods and all Lot's people, all Lot's servants and those that were working for Lot. He brought all of them back out of that place that they were captured in. And what is very, very interesting in chapter 14 is that we see the first mention of the word tithe in Scripture. But it's really interesting how it's mentioned, and I'm not going to go into much detail of trying to explain it. I'm just going to give you this information. Maybe at another time we could discuss the word tithe. But what we see happen is that Abraham, when he returns all the goods that were taken from Sodom and Gomorrah, the king of Salem, whose name is Melchizedek, he's known as the priest king. He's the only priest that actually served as a king as well. Melchizedek gives Abraham a tithe from all that he brings back. So Abraham brings back all that was stolen, right? He returns all of it. And then out of that, the king of Salem, Melchizedek, decides he's going to give him 1/10 of it. He's going to give him a tithe. The word tithe meaning 1/10. And he gives Abraham 1/10 of it as a offering, as a thank you for him bringing back all that was stolen. Now, Abraham actually didn't take it. He said that he didn't want anything from these nations, that at least they say later down that they made him into who he was, and because of their gift to him, that's why he's wealthy, that's why he's blessed. Remember, God had already given him a call that God would be the one to establish him, and that's really unique about Abraham. So he says, no, I don't want it. But it's interesting here that we see the word tithe, and it's not referred to giving unto God, 10%, but it's actually referred to an offering that is given to Abraham as a thank you. Now, I'm not saying that I don't believe in the tithe. I'm not saying that the tithe should be given to man instead of God. I'm just saying this is what it says in chapter 14 of Genesis. And like I say, we could always do a separate study on tithing, on giving, and this aspect. We definitely do a Bible study to go more in depth into that. Chapter 15, we see the covenant, right? God makes a covenant. He established a covenant with Abraham. And Abraham says to God, Lord God, what will you give me, seeing I am childless? So in other words, he's trying to say to God, whatever you give me, it's going to die in my generation because I don't have any children, no, any heirs to pass it on to. Then God brought him outside of the tent that he was speaking to Abraham in, and he said, look, now look towards the heaven and count all the stars. And if you are able to number them, all the stars in the sky, he said to him, so shall your descendants be. So this was the covenant that God made with Abraham. Again, he's reiterating this promise to make a great nation out of him. And he's saying, just as the stars are in the sky innumerable, so shall your descendants be. And we can see now, in the time that we live in, that this prophecy has been fulfilled. Because not only are the Jews, the nation of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, but all around the world, there are countless numbers of pockets of Jews scattered throughout the world. There are so many people that are of Jewish background, either half Jewish or full Jewish, or some descendants, and somebody in their genealogy were a Jew. And it just kind of reiterates this promise that God gave to Abraham, that his descendants will be like innumerable as the stars are in the sky. And so too, it has been fulfilled in terms of the seed of Abraham, the Jewish nation, and how innumerable they are across the face of the world. Number 6, chapter 16, the maidservant, right? The maidservant. So this is probably one of the highlights of Abraham's life. You've probably heard this story many times before. And that was that Sarai, his wife, she was barren. And she decided to tell Abraham, take my maidservant as your wife instead so that you can have a child from him, trying to manufacture the promise that God had given him, that he would give them a child. So it says that now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children. And she said, she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abraham, see now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go in to my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her. And Abraham heeded the voice of Sarai. That's where he went wrong, right? He should have never heeded the voice of Sarai on this matter because God gave him a promise. And out of that relationship with his handmaid, Sarai's maidservant named Hagar, he bore a child, and that child's name was Ishmael, right? So Ishmael was born from Hagar, and Abraham was 86 years old when he had Ishmael, right? So Ishmael born out of Hagar, and Abraham was 86 years old when he had Ishmael. Next, the name change. So in chapter 17, we see that there is some name changes that occur. Abram was 99 years old. So I've been saying Abraham, but his name was Abram. That was his given name by his father. And God changes his name from Abram, which means exalted father, to Abraham, which means father of many, right? So his name changes from Abram to Abraham. Likewise, Sarai, whose name is princess, changes to Sarah, which means mother of many nations, right? So there's a name change that happened for both Abram and Sarai to Abraham and Sarah, right? This happens only in chapter 17. As you see, a lot has happened already. He's already had Ishmael, and he's already made that relationship with his handmaiden Hagar. So then God goes on to give him a covenant that he ought to keep. And this covenant was to be kept through Isaac, which would be his son with Sarah. Isaac is not born as yet, but God gives him a covenant, and he tells him the sign of the covenant will be circumcision, right? So he told him any child from the age of 8 days to every single male that is part of your family, in terms of those that are part of your house, your servants, your workers, every male person that works for you, that is part of your household, has to be circumcised. And what did Abraham do? Well, he kept the covenant of God, and he circumcised all the male that were part of his household. And that was a sign to be kept, that these were the people of God, and through that covenant and that sign of circumcision, that is where Abraham and his family would be blessed. Actually, if you were not circumcised, then you would not be blessed by God under that covenant that he made with Abraham to bless him and his generations and to multiply them and to make them into a great nation, right? So there was the name change. And finally, in chapter 18 is the promised son. Isaac is born, right? And how it happens is that an angel visits Abraham. Abraham prepares a meal for him, serves the angel, and the angel says that in 9 months from now, your wife Sarah will have a child. Sarah overhears the conversation. She's not in the room, and she laughs when she hears this because she says, "How am I past childbearing age? I'm in my late I'm 90 around this time. She's 90 years old. Abraham is 99 years old, and she's thinking, how is this even possible? This is not going to happen." She laughs, but then when the angel confronts her and asks her why did she laugh, she lies about it and denies laughing about it, right? So in chapter 18, the promise of Isaac is given, the promised son. His name shall be called Isaac as well. And then from chapter 18, we move into a space where we see the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, a very popular Bible passage as well. And it starts off where the same angels that this angel that told Abraham he was going to have this son, Isaac, these angels now leave Abraham to go to Sodom and Gomorrah because they're going there to judge Sodom and Gomorrah because there's evilness and wickedness in the land, and they're going to pass out the judgment of God. Now, as they're about to go, the angels decide that let's tell Abraham what we're going to do. Abraham is found faithful before the sight of God, and God is speaking through these angels saying that he would want Abraham to know as well. So he tells Abraham, and Abraham then speaks to God, trying to negotiate for Sodom and Gomorrah. So he's negotiating, and he's saying, if you find this certain amount of righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah, then don't destroy the land, hold off your destruction, spare them. And he starts off by asking, if you find 50. If you find 50, would you spare the land? And God says, okay, I'll spare it if I find 50. Then he goes to 45. Now, I have a typo here, I have 44, but it's 45, right? He says, if you find 45, right, 45, would you spare the land of Sodom and Gomorrah? God says, okay, if you find 45. Abraham, again, couldn't find 45 righteous people. Then he goes down to 40. 40, right? Again, he couldn't find 40. He comes back to God, he negotiates again. He says, if I find 30. Again, he can't find 30. Then he comes back to God. He says, okay, if I find 20, can't find 20. Comes back to God again. He says, if I find 10, would you spare Sodom and Gomorrah? 10 righteous people. God said, yes, if you find 10, I will spare them. But they could not find 10, right? And because of that, Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed. The angels did go to Sodom and Gomorrah, but Lot and his family was spared from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But actually, we always hear that Lot and his family was spared, but it wasn't his whole family, because Lot had 2 daughters that lived in his house and his wife. That was who we always hear. Lot and his family were saved. But he also had other daughters, and they had already taken sons, but they had already taken husbands from Sodom and Gomorrah. And when Lot ran and told them that Sodom and Gomorrah was about to be destroyed, his sons-in-laws laughed at him, and they did not heed his voice. So his other daughters, who were already married, we don't know how many of them they were. The Bible says sons-in-laws and daughters, so it was definitely more than one. They were left behind, and they were destroyed in Sodom and Gomorrah. And even out of Lot's 2 daughters and his wife, not all of them made it out, because as they were exiting, the angel told them not to look back. And well, we know the story. Lot's wife, she looked back, and she turned into a pillar of salt. Now, based on research into the historical location of Sodom and Gomorrah, and looking at the climate and weather patterns around that time that Sodom and Gomorrah existed, and looking at the soil sediment remains in the location that is proposed to be Sodom and Gomorrah, it's believed that this pillar of salt that Lot's wife turned to, it was as a result of Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed by hailstone and hail fire, right? Fire falling from heaven. And while that fire was falling, the scientific reason is that fire would have created, that fire and brimstone that came from heaven, due to the climate and the environment there, it would have created a lot of salt residues. It would have converted into salt, right? So when you hear Lot's wife being turned into salt, it wasn't that she was cursed in a moment for looking back, and because she looked back, she was cursed and she was turned into a pillar of salt. But it was actually, this looking back refers to, she probably actually physically went back. It wasn't just her opening her eyes and looking, but she actually probably physically went back, and by physically returning, she would have gotten hit by some fire and brimstone and physically turned into salt, right? So that's kind of like a scientific explanation to the logic or the reasoning behind his wife turning into a pillar of salt, right? So Sodom and Gomorrah, chapters 18 through 19. So we're almost to the end of the life of Abraham. I'm sure by now you would have seen some things that stood out, right? But look at this, what happens in chapter 20, right? This, in chapter 20, is the lie. And I know what you're thinking, right? Didn't we cover the lie already in like chapter 12 when he just left the land of Haran? But this is actually him telling the same lie at another instant. In chapter 20, Abraham tells the exact same lie to King Abimelech, right? So Abraham is on a journey. He stops off in that space where Abimelech is king. And again, he thinks to himself, my wife is beautiful. The king is going to want my wife and he's going to kill me to take my wife. So what does he do again? Again, he tells the same lie. He tells Abimelech that Sarah is his sister. Now, he tells the same lie, but we see something different that happens this time, right? It says, but God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, indeed, you are a dead man because the woman whom you have taken, she is a man's wife. So Abimelech was actually a godly king, and God spoke to him and told him that this is the case, right? Abimelech then calls Abraham and asks Abraham, why do you lie to me? Abraham said, well, I thought this nation forsook God and they were evil and they didn't know God. I didn't know that this was the case, that you actually knew God. And Abimelech, again, was just like Pharaoh, was about to take Sarah as his wife. And when God spoke to him and he called Abraham into his courts, he asked Abraham, why did you lie to me? And this is actually fascinating because maybe you never knew this. But Abraham responds by saying that she is actually my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. So his reasoning for lying in both instances was that he was not telling a lie. He was telling a truth and withholding truth as well. So he was telling the truth that Sarah was his sister. She was his half sister. They had the same father, different mother. But he was withholding a truth, which is that she was also his wife. So she was his sister, half sister. But he intentionally was withholding the fact that she was his wife as well, right? So for those of you who didn't know, now you know Abraham and Sarah was actually step brother and step sister. And Abraham did lie, tell the same lie twice. In the second instance, in chapter 20, we see a truth revealed that she was actually his half-sister, right? So that's chapter 20. Chapter 21, Isaac is born, the promised child, right? And Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. And at 8 days old, Isaac was circumcised according to the covenant that God made with Abraham. And at that point, when Isaac was born, there was a family feud going on between Sarah and Hagar, because now Sarah had her child, Hagar had her child, which was Ishmael, and now there was this tension between the two women, considering that one was his child with his wife, one was his child with his handmaid. And because of that, Ishmael and Hagar had to depart, but God made a promise to Abraham and he made a promise to Ishmael that he will fulfill that same promise to bless Isaac. He would fulfill that promise over Ishmael because Ishmael was the seed of Abraham and he will make him a great nation. And God continued to care for Ishmael. We see that he provided water in the desert. He continued to care for Ishmael and Hagar, and he did fulfill that promise to make Ishmael into a great nation, right? The test, chapter 22. This is the most significant thing about the life of Abraham. We've all heard about it, right? God says to Abraham, take your son whom you love so much, carry him to Mount Moriah, place him on an altar and sacrifice him. And this was a test, right? So Abraham does it. He takes his son, he carries him to Mount Moriah, he prepares an altar to make the sacrifice. And just as he lifts his knife and he's about to make the sacrifice, an angel of the Lord says, stop, don't harm the lad, don't harm the boy. And when Abraham looks over, he sees a ram caught by its thorn in a piece of bush, a thicket of bush. And instead, he takes the ram and he sacrifices the ram instead. And then he says, this place that I found the lamb shall be named the Lord will provide, which is translated in some cases to Jehovah Jireh, where we get this term, the Lord will provide, right? So this is the test. Abraham passed the test because he was willing to give up his son Isaac, even though he loved him so much, because he loved God more. All right. And this is where he gets this name of being the father of faith. This is where it's quoted in the New Testament that great faith was that Abraham had was a man of great faith, because he was willing to have faith in what God had told him to do in that moment, which was to murder his son, right? And that definitely is great faith. So he passed that test in chapter 22. And if you're counting, we're almost to the end of the life of Abraham, right? Because remember, it was chapter 12 till chapter 25. So we just have 3 more chapters. And after Isaac after Isaac is born, after Abraham passed this test, the next thing that happens is Sarah passes away, right? Chapter 23, Sarah dies. Sarah lived until 127 years. Sarah died in Hebron, and she was buried in a cave in the field of Machpelah, right? So Sarah dies at the age of 127. Now Abraham is left without a wife. Isaac is left without a mother. He's old in age. He's a man by now. And in chapter 24, we're almost at the end. And like I told you, we're going to see something in chapter 25 that you don't expect. In chapter 24, Abraham decides, I'm going to find a wife for my son Isaac. And he wanted the wife to be from the land that he was originally from, the land of Ur, not from the Canaanites. He didn't want him to take a wife from the Canaanites. The reason being is because the Canaanites worshipped pagan gods, and he didn't want his son to get caught up in that culture, to be unequally yoked, right? So he made one of his servants make him a promise to go back to the land that he is from and find him a wife there. So this servant went to Nahor to find a wife for Isaac, and the servant took 10 camels, and he took a lot of gifts, a lot of gold. And the servant said to himself, God, help me to find this wife, find this woman. And God said to him, whichever woman comes to the well when your camel is there drinking water and gives water to you and the camel, this would be the woman. So he had his camels laid out by the well, and lo and behold, Rebekah, born to Bethuel, son of Milcah, wife of Noah, right? She came and she gave him water. What's really interesting is that Rebekah would have also been the cousin of Isaac, because her father was actually Abraham's brother, right? It says Rebekah, born to Bethuel, son of Milcah, wife of Noah, Abraham's brother, right? So Rebekah was actually related as well to Isaac, just as Abraham was related to Sarah. And it says that the servant, he goes on to give Rebekah jewelry, silver, gold. Guys, if you want to get a wife, this is what you got to do, right? Silver, gold, clothing. And then he also gave precious things to her brother and mother, right? So he had to bribe the family as well. And in doing that, he actually was able to convince Rebekah to go back to Canaan with him and to marry Isaac, right? So Rebekah became the bride of Isaac. Chapter 24, we're finished with chapter 24. Last chapter, chapter 25. This is going to blow your mind. Here we find the death of Abraham, right? But the chapter starts off by telling us something that I never knew. I'm 99% sure you never knew it either. But just before he dies, after his son Isaac finds a wife, Abraham actually takes another wife. He remarries. So he has another wife after Sarah, and she's named Keturah. And not just that he marries someone else after Sarah dies, not only does he take another woman as his wife, but with this woman, he has 6 sons. That's right. He has 6 sons with Keturah. Can you imagine that? Did you know that? Like, my mind is completely blown, right? I always knew Abraham had 2 sons, Isaac and Ishmael, but he actually in total would have had 8 sons, 6 sons with Keturah, 1 son with Hagar, and 1 son with Sarah, right? So these 6 sons, he ended up sending these 6 sons to live to the east of Isaac, because Isaac was that promised child that was meant to carry the blessing of God. And he gave everything in terms of possessions to Isaac. He gave his other 6 sons, he gave them gifts of different sorts. He did bless them, but not the blessing that was that covenant that God made with him, that he would make him into a great nation. That promise was passed on to Isaac to be fulfilled through Isaac and through his generations, right? And Abraham died at the age of 175 years old. And it says that Isaac and Ishmael buried Abraham in a cave in Machpelah. That's the same cave that Sarah was buried in. And I find that's really poetic that both his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, did bury him after his death. They were the ones to place him in the tomb, that there was still that relationship between the both of them at his death. There was that unity between the two brothers, right? So this is the life of Abraham. We've covered from Genesis chapter 12 through 25, the entire life of Abraham, a lot of information. I'm sure a lot of it you probably like, okay, I need to rewatch this. I probably missed a part of it. You can rewind, you can rewatch. If you have any questions or comments, you can feel free to contact me directly, or you can leave it in the comment section. I definitely will get back to you. Thanks so much for joining on in our Bible study. If you didn't do it as yet, hit that subscribe button, hit that share button, and I'll see you again as we continue in the book of Genesis. Continue reading from chapters 25, go forward. Next, in our next session, we're going to actually be looking at the life of Isaac. So I'll see you again. Take care, everyone.